Zeitoun, page 120. To spend the night at a friend's house there, Ahmed would fly to Houston immediately, and in the morning he would meet her there and drive the family all the way to Phoenix. "Are you sure?" Kathy asked. "I'm your sister, you're my sister, you're all I have," Hugo said. Her mother, Kimiko, had passed away that year. The loss had been devastating to both Hugo and Kathy. This got Kathy crying all over again. This morning, Zeitoun woke after 9, exhausted from the howling of the dogs. He was determined this day to find them. After his prayers, he paddled over his flooded yard. The dogs seemed very near. He crossed the street and went left on Dart. Only a few houses down, he found the source. It was a house he knew well. He paddled closer, and the dogs went wild, their desperate sounds coming from within. Now he had to find a way inside. The first story was flooded, so he assumed the dogs, 2 of them, he guessed, were trapped on the second floor. There were many bowed trees near the house. He paddled to it and tied the canoe to the trunk. He lifted himself into the tree, climbing until he could see through a second-story window. He saw no dogs, but he could hear them. They were in that house, and they knew he was close. The tree where he was standing was about 10 feet from the window. He couldn't jump. It was too far. At that moment, he spotted a plank a foot wide and 16 feet long floating in the side yard. He climbed down, paddled to the plank, brought it to the house, and leaned it against the tree. He climbed up against and lifted the plank to create a bridge between the tree and the roof. He was about 16 feet off the ground, about 8 feet above the water line. The bridge he created was not so different from the scaffolding he used every day in his work, so after testing it quickly with the weight of 1 foot, he walked across and onto the roof. From there, he pried a window open and ducked into the house. The barking grew louder and more urgent. He walked through the bedroom he arrived in, hearing the dogs grow more hysterical. As he strode through the second-floor hallway, he saw them, 2 dogs, a black Labrador and a small mixed breed, in a cage. They had no food, and their water dish was empty. They seemed confused enough to bite him, but he didn't hesitate. He opened the cage and let them out. The Labrador ran past him and out of the room. The smaller dog cowered in the cage. Zeitoun stepped back to give him room, but he stayed where he was. For the Labrador, there was nowhere to go. He tried the stairs and saw the water reach to just a few inches below the second floor. He returned to Zeitoun, who had a plan. "Wait here," he told them. He walked back across the plank bridge, climbed down the tree and into his canoe, and paddled back to his house. He climbed up to the roof, slipped through the window, and went down the few steps to the underwater. Knowing Kathy kept the freezer stocked with meat and vegetables, he leaned down and removed 2 steaks, quickly closing the door to keep the finite cold from escaping. He walked back up to the roof, grabbed 2 plastic water bottles, and dropped them and the steaks into the canoe below. He shimmied down and returned to the house of the dogs. Again, they sensed him approaching, and this time they were both waiting by the window, their heads peeking over the sill. And they smelled the meat, frozen though it was. They began barking wildly, their tails wagging. Zeitoun refilled their water dish, and they dove for it. After drinking their fill, they went to work on the steaks, gnawing on them until the meat thawed. Zeitoun watched for a few minutes, tired and content, until he heard more barking. There were other dogs, and he had a freezer full of food. He went back to his house to prepare. He stacked more meat into the canoe and went in search of the other animals left behind. Almost immediately after leaving his house, he heard a distinct barking, muffled, coming from almost the same location as the dogs he had just found. He paddled closer, wondering if there was actually a third dog in the home he'd just been in. He anchored the canoe to the tree again, took 2 sticks with him, and climbed up. From the middle bow, he looked this time to the neighboring house, the one on the left, and saw 2 more dogs jumping against the glass. He pulled the plank away from the first house and arranged it to extend to the other. The dogs, seeing him coming, went wild, leaping in place. In a moment, he had opened the window and stepped in, the 2 dogs jumping at him. He dropped the 2 stakes, and the dogs pounced, forgetting about him entirely. He needed to give them water, too, so he again paddled home and brought more water bottles and a bowl back to them. Zeitoun left the window open enough to allow the dogs to get fresh air, then walked across the plank again and climbed down the tree to his canoe. He paddled off, thinking it was about time to call Kathy. As he paddled, he noticed that the water was growing more contaminated. It was darker now, opaque, streaked with oil and gasoline, polluted with debris, food, garbage, clothing, pieces of homes. But Zeitoun was in high spirits. He felt invigorated by what he'd been able to do for the dogs, that he was there for those animals, and 4 dogs that almost certainly would have starved would now live because he had stayed behind and because he had bought that old canoe. He